Okay. If you can see my screen, just give a nod and then I know. Good, thank you. Okay. So a few weeks ago, Matan arranged for my teacher, Rav Chen, and I to give a 15-minute Zoom on this topic in Hebrew. And it was very warmly received. The feedback was very enthusiastic. People said it was so thought-provoking, really interesting. So we decided to do the same thing in English. So this is a 15-minute sort of quick tour of the question, what do we do if we are at someone's house who is not observant, they are not keeping the laws of Kashrut, and we don't know what to do, what we can eat, what we can use, etc. It could be that we've been invited by our secular neighbor. We've been invited by our irreligious family member, or we're having a picnic. It's like a potluck picnic and everyone's brought something and we don't know what we can eat, etc. So it's a very common question. And we'd like to give some tools this evening to deal with the situation of eating at someone's house, let's say, or with someone who is not observant of the laws of Kashrut. So I'd like to begin by addressing the sort of running through the issues that could arise, not all of which will be addressed this evening. Okay. First of all, we have the question of the ingredients themselves or the products themselves. Something has been placed before you. Well, can I assume that this food item is kosher? Do I need to check if this food item is kosher? How do I know if the ingredients that have been used are kosher? Second question is, let's say we have something made with kosher ingredients in kosher utensils. They've, let's say, ordered in takeout, but now they're going to place it onto a plate that is not kosher. What do we do in that situation? Or using cutlery that is not kosher. Another issue is what happens if they're using kosher ingredients, but they're now cooking up a dish for us in non-kosher pots and pans. What do we do then? A further issue is the point of utensils which have not been toiveled. What do we do in that situation? And the further few points, which we are not going to get to this evening, are, remember, we have the issue of bugs, and vegetables are included. They're serving us a salad. What do we do if we're worried that they haven't checked for bugs? What do we do with fruit or vegetables which may not have had maaser taken from them? And finally, if relevant, the issue of hafrashat challah, of taking challah from a certain amount of dough. So if we go through, as I said, really the first four issues, if we go through them one by one, if we start with the idea of the ingredients themselves or the products themselves, I think it's fair to say, if we are discussing Israel today, that the majority of ingredients of products are purchased from supermarket chains which have a Tu'udat Kashrut. And therefore, one can assume that certain ingredients are kosher. Think of a scenario, let's say a lasagna. You can assume the pasta sheets, the tomato sauce, the cheese, etc., is kosher because the majority of cheeses, pasta sauces, etc., are purchased in all the supermarket chains which have Tu'udot Kashrut. Now, ideally, one should still check. One can ask the question, where did you purchase it, or did you buy everything for this meal from Supercell, whatever? And that is the ideal, that you can ask relevant questions. However, the Pri Chadash says that if by asking the question, you will really insult your host or hostess, or you'll cause strife, disagreements between you, then it is better in that situation not to ask. And therefore, it really depends on the sensitivities of each case. You know, decide on a case-by-case basis, basically. But I have another question, because I'm already describing a situation where I have said that I'm at someone's house who does not observe the laws of Kashrut. So does it actually help for me to ask them about the Kashrut of the products? Can I rely on their answer? So Rav Melamed writes in Pninei Halacha that somebody who has not who is known not to observe the laws of Kashrut, however, in general, would be described as an upstanding person, a pleasant person, one who you can rely on and trust in general, to ask them as simple questions such as, where did you buy the ingredients? Or did you go to a shop with a Tuadat Kashrut? You can rely on their answer. So the information that they provide you will be helpful, and you can rely on it in making your decision about what to eat or not eat. I would just like to add one more point on this topic, and that is that we are sometimes sort of reluctant to ask questions and to ask our neighbor or our family member where they went shopping, etc. However, they may be waiting for the questions. You know, your non-religious colleague knows that you're religious, and they may be waiting for your questions. Where did you buy it? Where did you cook it? Did you cook it? Have you bought it? Etc. etc. They may be waiting for the questions, and therefore, again, on a case-by-case basis, we should decide. But it may be ideal to ask the questions that you want to know, and perhaps as long as we ask it in a pleasant, sensitive way, we will not cause insult to the hostess. Okay, to move on to the next question. We have kosher ingredients, and they've used the kosher ingredients to make something in kosher dishes, or they've bought something in. Okay, so they've ordered in takeout. But now we've got hot food that is going to be placed on their plates, which are not kosher. They may have had basar v'chalav together, etc. Or we need to use their non-kosher cutlery. So what do we do in such a scenario? So in the Shulchan Aruch, it is written, Chom shel kli rishon shehayad soledet bo, mevashel v'oser kulo. If we have something that is really hot, the heat of a kli rishon, which is the saucepan on the fire or the dish that is in the oven, if we have something that is in this primary utensil and is piping hot, shehayad soledet bo, for our purposes, let's call that 45 degrees plus. So at that temperature or above that temperature, the taste can be transferred. And therefore, the taste from their non-kosher plates could be absorbed into the food that you are now about to eat. It continues, aval chom shel kli sheni eino mavashel. The second we're talking about, the heat in a kli sheni, it doesn't cook, meaning no ta'am, no taste can be transferred in a secondary utensil. So the second you've transferred the food from the saucepan into the bowl, or you've taken something out of the dish and placed it on the plate, and on the serving platter, let's say, at that point, we are talking about the secondary utensil, the kli sheni, and therefore we're not worried any longer about the transfer of taste. So first of all, the most important point that we draw out from here is that if we have anything at a temperature less than 45 degrees, there can be no transfer of taste. Meaning they've served you all this lovely kosher food on their serving platter, or they have taken the takeout out of the bag and it's all laid out there on the table. You can now wait just a minute or two and only transfer it onto your plate when the temperature has dropped slightly. And then immediately you've avoided the problem, because there can be no transfer of taste under 45 degrees. As I said, there is also the secondary point that anything that you put in a secondary utensil, according to many opinions, does not transfer taste, regardless of the temperature. Now, that point is a matter for debate, but there are those who you can rely on who would say that at any temperature in a secondary utensil, there's no transfer of taste. And as I said, the ideal scenario would be to let it cool down for a minute and then transfer something onto their plate, or then pick up your cutlery and start eating, and there will be no transfer of taste. If we move now to perhaps the hardest issue, what happens if they're using kosher ingredients, but they are cooking for you in non-kosher pots and pans? So what do we say then? First of all, the issue that we are discussing here is what is called ta'am balua. The concern here is that I don't know what they cooked in this saucepan yesterday. Even if I think it's quite hard for them to get hold of real treif, they don't keep meat and milk separate. So they have a saucepan that essentially is not kosher because it's got both meat and milk in it. I'm talking, though, about the taste that has been absorbed into the utensil. I'm not talking about any real forbidden food item here. And therefore, it's important to begin with this point. According to the vast majority of authorities, the idea of ta'am balua, taste that's been absorbed into something, which I'm worried is going to now be transferred into the food that they're going to serve me, is a problem on a d'Rabbanan level, on a rabbinic level. So I wanted to open with that. Second of all, this is a really important halachic principle to remember. Stam kelim einam bnei oman. What does that mean? A utensil that you don't know anything about can be assumed to not have been used in the last 24 hours. We can assume that a random pot or pan has not been used for 24 hours. And as soon as something is categorized as Eino ben yomo, it hasn't been used for 24 hours or more, we say that any taste that would come out of that into the food will be ta'am pagum, like an unpleasant taste. In a b'diavad situation, in a difficult situation where you don't have any other alternative, you are sitting there with your host or with your colleague, etc. This is the food that's being placed before you. In a b'diavad situation, ta'am pagum is mutar, an unpleasant taste from a saucepan that hasn't been used for 24 hours is totally permissible. And therefore, if something, according to the strict letter of the law, if something has been cooked in a saucepan that has asur taste in it, that has forbidden taste in it, and you're worried that's going to be absorbed into your food, because we can assume it hasn't been used for 24 hours, it is permissible. Now, two caveats that I want to make. The principle that we've just established, which is a really important halachic principle to remember, only applies to like household utensils and not, for example, utensils in a restaurant, because we cannot assume, we can't apply the same principle and say it is safe to assume they haven't used it for 24 hours, which is definitely the halachic assumption in a private home. In a restaurant, it's not realistic to say, well, this and this hasn't been used for 24 hours. It's in constant use. So that's one side point. Second of all, despite what I've just said, there are those who are more stringent and who say you cannot eat food that has been cooked in a saucepan that has been used for basar v'chalav together, let's say, or you don't know what's been in it, okay? It's got forbidden taste of some sort inside of it. And why do they say this? Because they say, kansu chachamim, meaning as if they are imposing a fine or a penalty on those who cook in saucepans which are forbidden. And therefore, whoever cooks b'mezid, deliberately, in a utensil, even if it hasn't been used for 24 hours, but it's a utensil that has forbidden taste in it, the food may not be eaten by that person, and the food may not be eaten by anyone else who they have cooked the food for. Now, this, of course, means that according to those who are stringent, if something has actually been cooked by your secular colleague or your non-religious neighbor, you cannot eat it. The only other point I would make is, according to some, it's very, very difficult to describe these types of people as hamavashel b'mezid, that they're cooking deliberately in a pot that had forbidden taste. It's very interesting. In the context of Shabbat, for example, we really commonly refer to secular non-observant Jews as b'shogeg and not b'mezid. They are accidentally or non-intentionally breaking Shabbat rather than deliberately doing so. And this is primarily due to their lack of knowledge. If they don't know all the laws of Shabbat or all the laws of Kashrut, you wouldn't describe it as a deliberate act. And therefore, according to many, this is difficult because to describe them as having deliberately done so, and therefore Chachamim have imposed a penalty on the food that's been cooked as a result, is a difficult way to describe the situation. However, having said all that, and having stated that there are those who are more lenient, I would say that we also have to balance sort of the strict rules of kashrut also with the idea of chilul Hashem. Again, similar to what I mentioned earlier, these people who are hosting you in whatever scenario, they know that you are religious. And perhaps if you eat the food that they've cooked in their forbidden pots, you are actually creating a chilul Hashem, desecrating Hashem's name. It almost shows them, oh, really? Like when they're out of the home, they're just going to eat anything. They're not asking me any questions. They're not being a bit fussy here. So again, it really has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But the idea of chilul Hashem is also one factor to take into account here. Finally, we have the idea of utensils that haven't been toiveled. And what should we do? And can we eat the food that is, let's say, totally kosher? You've got no issue whatsoever. Again, takeout, for example, but they are placing it on their plates, which they haven't toiveled, or you need to use their cutlery, which hasn't been toiveled. What should we do here? Okay, so the idea of toiveling utensils has different categories. First of all, if we're talking about metal items, then the obligation is on a Torah level. If we're talking about glass, it's on a rabbinic level. And other materials, for example, plastic, we are exempt from doing so. And therefore, you build up this order of priorities. Because if I can take the food and put it on a plastic plate or a paper plate, whatever, good, lovely, great. If I can't, then I could use like a real plastic plate, or a glass item would be my next best option. So you can see that we've built up here an order of priorities of what would be ideal to use if we possibly could. However, it's really important to emphasize that food that has been placed already onto a plate or whatever that hasn't been toiveled is not forbidden. So this is a really, really common example. They've poured me already a glass of water. They placed some food on the plate for me. That is not a problem for me to eat. It says explicitly, we'll read here in the Ramah, V'im avar v'hishtamesh b'kli b'lo tvila, lo ne'esar ma shenishtamesh bo. Okay, so they didn't do what they were supposed to do, and they didn't toivel the dish, but now what it has been used for, what's been placed in it already, is not forbidden. However, we have a more difficult situation because sometimes they didn't place it in the bowl, on the plate, whatever for you. Sometimes you need to go and take the food and serve it up for yourself and place it on the plate. So now we have a different situation because I am deliberately taking the food and placing it on this dish that hasn't been toiveled, or I'm picking up my cutlery and initiating the eating process. So what do I do there? So it's a machloket. There is a debate. There are those who are stringent and there are those who are more lenient. So, for example, Rav Ovadia Yosef says, if you've been invited to someone's house and you know that they haven't toiveled their dishes, then you cannot eat you cannot use their dishes or their glasses that have not been toiveled. However, many others are more lenient. For example, the Hagat Maimoniot says the idea of toiveling kelim means you have to take this dish and toivel it, but it doesn't follow on from there that what is being placed in it, what you are using it for, is forbidden for you to do. Rav Yaakov Ariel explains it very clearly. He says the obligation is on the person. They have to toivel the dishes. They should have done so. But the obligation, so to speak, is not on the object. This object, which hasn't been toiveled, even though it should have been, is not a forbidden object to you. And others say also, they add in the idea of if we already, at worst, are dealing with something that's being placed in a dish that wasn't toiveled, at worst, we are dealing with a rabbinic command, then in the face of someone's insult or shame, the idea of kavod habriot, in such a situation, you can be lenient and rely on the lenient views and not cause insult or pain or shame to someone. So again, this issue, just like all the other issues which we discussed, have many different sensitivities at hand. But I think this is really a common scenario that people are in. And many people are used to it, and they're used to asking the right questions, or they're used to informing their hosts before the event even begins, what they will be prepared or won't be prepared to use, to eat, etc. But if someone is in an uncomfortable situation, it's sometimes also very, very important to know the bottom line halacha, to know there are lenient views who say such and such, and to know when it is the correct situation to rely on them as well. So I hope this was informative and interesting, and have a very good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If anybody has a brief question, we can, or you can post it on the group.
Thank you. That was great.
Have a good evening.